So, since Steve is not presenting, our next presenter is Shabbir Abbas. He's a graduate student, he's a GMSA member, and he's pursuing religious studies, Islamic studies, and basically religion and culture. Today he's going to present about Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb, the father of terror and unlikely defense. So, I give it up to you.
Nice to be here. Go Shabs!
My respected scholars, brothers, sisters in faith and in humanity, I greet you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I was accepted into graduate school in June 2014, and likewise the fall of Mosul took place in June 2014. Hence, as soon as I began my research career, I was thrust into researching ISIS and other similar groups, something that I personally did not choose but was forced upon by the needs of the hour. My personal interest is in the study of early Islam and medieval Islam, and because of this, my analysis of ISIS is ultra unique in comparison to the others researching it today. And what I'm doing to present tonight is just one small chapter in an otherwise lengthy piece. So after the seemingly abrupt rise of ISIS in June 2014, numerous articles came about trying to explain to the astonished world who ISIS is ideologically and where they originate from. Of these articles, two that received much fanfare were the articles of both the former British diplomat and founder director of the Conflicts Forum, Alistair Crooke, as well as that of the renowned author and researcher on comparative religions, Karen Armstrong, who both produced similar arguments. Alistair Crooke writes on the bloody methodology of ISIS and how its architect was Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb. Similarly, Karen Armstrong, in her article, quite vociferously argues that ISIS is not a new, albeit not distant either, phenomena, for it is very much part and parcel of the Wahhābī movement. I disagree with her, which we'll see later on. Nonetheless, these two scholars are not alone in making such assumptions. Since the 18th century's dramatic rise of Wahhabism from within the deserts of Arabia till today, perhaps no singular group has received more blame for death and destruction within the Islamic world. Hence, Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb is seen by many as the father of terror. This paper will investigate as to why this is so and its historicity, because honestly, I have a contention with this. I will not argue against the claim that Ibn Abd al-Wahhab is connected with modern-day terror, but I will argue against the claim that he is the father of terror. For all those who conclude him to be as such, they analyze history by looking at Ibn Abd al-Wahhab and post-Ibn Abd al-Wahhab. I disagree and instead look at history pre-Ibn Abd al-Wahhab to Ibn Abd al-Wahhab to post-Ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Is this terror we find in ISIS truly a legacy of Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, or was Ibn Abd al-Wahhab coming from the lineage of such who just struck political success? To do so, three aspects of terror were focused in the study: fundamentalism, militancy, and intolerance. By doing so, an attempt will be made to try and map the terror of today to its roots, its religious inspiration. If Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab were the father of terror, these three, fundamentalism, militancy, and intolerance, would have to all originate from him. Is this the case? Let us see. So fundamentalism, this is my definition, a form of religion, especially Islam, that upholds belief in the strict literal interpretation of Scripture, Quran and Hadith. Strict adherence to the basic principles of any subject or discipline. There is no doubt in the statement that Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab was a fundamentalist, that he considered the words found in both the Quran and Hadith to be literally true, but arguing that he was a progenitor of fundamentalism is questionable at best, for he himself was brought up in an existing school of fundamentalism. Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb came from a long line of Hanbali scholars, and we all know that today the Sunni world has come to agreement that there are four schools of Islam: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali. But this was not always the case. Ahmad ibn Hanbal and his namesake, the Hanbali school, were historically considered distinct from the other three schools of Sunni Islam. Why so? We'll look into it. There is little doubt in the claim that Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a proto-fundamentalist, and hence his school too developed into somewhat fundamentalist movement. Muhammad Abu Zahra, in his biographical work, Ibn Hanbal Hayatuhu Asrihi, writes, he hesitated when others went ahead, and wavered when others resolved. He paused over the meaning when others spoke. He was silent about fatwas when others rushed to give them. That is why his inclination to hadith predominated over his fiqh, leading some scholars to reckon him a hadith scholar rather than a faqih. Thus, At-Tabari did not mention Imam Ahmad's school when discussing the disagreements of the fuqaha in his book, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha. He said about him, he was a man of hadith, not a man of fiqh, and he was tried on that account. Some fuqaha who used to study disagreements, like At-Tahawi, Ad-Dabusi, Al-Nasafi, Al-Asli, Al-Maliki, who wrote Ad-Dalail fi Ummahat al-Masail, and Al-Ghazali, did not mention him among the fuqaha. In Ma'arif ibn Qutayba did not mention him among the fuqaha as well. Al-Maqdisi mentioned him in the best category of the people of hadith. Qadi Iyad states in Al-Madarik he was less than an imam in fiqh, although he had excellence in investigation of its sources. Abu Hanifa, Malik ibn Anas, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi left mountains of fiqh works behind in the forms of Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, Al-Muwadda, Kitab Kitab al-Risala fi Usul al-Fiqh, whereas Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal left only his Musnad, a collection of hadith. Therefore, the importance of hadith over other things caused Hanbalism to become an outlier among the early Sunni schools. However, one may ask, why is this so? For the term Sunni in itself demands an importance of the Sunnah traditions as found in the hadith. The answer to this would be that hadith remain of the utmost importance to all within Sunnism. However, it is the understanding of the hadith that is the fork in the road. In developing jurisprudence, all four of the Sunni schools agreed upon the Quran and the Sunnah. The disagreement, however, occurred in the usage of qiyas and ijma', for which all except the Hanbali schools agreed upon. Qiyas in practice allowed for the inspection and re-evaluation of the Islamic literature, Quran and Hadith, by methodology of analogy to entertain modern or contemporary meanings in response to the fluidity of time and setting. This allowed for individual subjective conclusions. This latter allowance was not acceptable to Ahmad ibn Hanbal. For him, what was written in scripture was also set in stone. Therefore, anything other than a literal understanding of the material would be tantamount to challenging God, the Prophet, and the companions. This rejection of qiyas by Ahmad ibn Hanbal is the point of origination for modern-day Sunni fundamentalism, albeit latter Hanbali movements have, to a rare extent, allowed for the usage of qiyas only in the extremest of circumstances, when no other source of law is to be found. Similarly, Ahmad ibn Hanbal only allowed ijma', binding consensus, for the Sahaba and outlawed it for all generations preceding. Now, how does fundamentalism relate to terror? Fundamentalism relates to terror by allowing what was otherwise disallowed by jurists in modern times, such as slavery, for example. It is not erroneous to say that the Prophet Muhammad, whilst abhorring it, deemed slavery permissible. However, many, if not most, jurists today have deemed it impermissible via the usage of ijma'. Fundamentalists who deny such judgments will actively use violence and terror to obtain slaves, as in the case of both the ISIS and Boko Haram. Therefore, we all remember the famed letter to Baghdadi, signed by the likes of Hamza Yusuf Hansen, Yasir Qadi, Muhammad al-Yaqubi. I wonder if the letter was truly addressed to al-Baghdadi or it was for the ignorant Western world. For anyone with the slightest understanding of classical Hanbalism would know that arguments like this mean nil to the likes of al-Baghdadi. The reintroduction of slavery is forbidden in Islam. It was abolished by universal consensus. It's a joke. Militancy. Using violent means in support of a cause without proper authorization. Now, after examining the Wahhābī doctrinal link of Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb to Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the history of the movement after Ibn Hanbal and prior to Ibn Abd al-Wahhāb must too be examined to see whether violent terror, militancy, is truly a product of Ibn Abd al-Wahhāb or if it was normative for the Hanbali movement in general. Nimrod Hurwitz, considered an expert in Hanbalism, writes in his work, Formation of Hanbalism, Piety to Power, on what he says are the ideological elements that transformed Hanbalis into the leading force of Sunni communal violence. This work of his is vital to not only the current investigation, but to all interested in the subject. We will delve into how Hanbalis became this leading force of Sunni communal violence. Moving on, during the medieval era, the Abbasi Caliphate represented by and large the authoritative aspirations of Sunni school of Islam. Now, somebody tell me how the Abbasi Caliphate fell. Anyone? Mongols. Many, if not most, would say the Mongols. Symbolically, yes, but in reality, the Abbasi Khulafa were in name only at that time. Their power ended centuries prior. Returning to our topic, amongst the plethora of schools vying for influence, no school was a greater thorn for the Abbasi Caliphate than the Sunni Hanbalis of Baghdad, and no greater series of incidents than during the role of Caliph Radiyullah, who reigned from 934 to 940. For the Hanbalis played a decisive role in the downfall of Caliphal rule. The Abbasis, after just having successfully quelled numerous uprising insurgencies, namely of the Zanjis, Zaydis, and Ismailis, became plagued by such internal turmoil in the capital city of Baghdad that the Caliph became preoccupied in dealing with it. And this preoccupation served as a coup de grace for the Abbasi Caliphate. Without control over the capital city, the empire became ineffective against foreign threats. Thus, Arabi is seen as the last of the real caliphs, who was the last to deliver orations at the Friday service, to hold assemblies, to commune with the philosophers, to discuss the questions of the day, to take counsel on the affairs of state, to distribute alms, or to temper the severity of cruel officers. After him, thus ended the early Baghdad Abbasids. The Orientalist William Muir in his Caliphate, The Caliphate to Rise, Its Rise, Decline, and Fall, writes on the destructive force of the Hanbalis. Regarding Baghdad during this reign, we are chiefly told of the heated outbursts of fanaticism and intolerance that still prevailed. The Hanbalis, supported by popular sentiment, carried things with a high hand, forcing their way into private dwellings. They overthrew everything not in strict conformity with their tenets, emptied vessels of wine wherever found, broken pieces, musical instruments, pried into the details of trade and commerce, and set up in face a kind of inquisition. Thus, a professor of the Shi'i creed for holding transmigration was impaled and eventually burned alive. A famous doctor also was badly handled for affirming some various readings of the Quran, of no apparent moment in themselves, and notwithstanding that he submitted written recantation, had to fly Baghdad, lest he should be torn in pieces by the angry mob. In response to this inquisition, the Caliph Aradi produced a fatwa in the year 323 AH, expelling the Hanabila from the Muslim community. This decree has been preserved in Ibn Miskawayh's Tajarib al-Umm. Let me read it. In this year, Badr Khashani, who was the police chief of Baghdad, wrote and proclaimed on both sides of Baghdad that no two Hanbali followers of Abu Muhammad Barbahari were to assemble in one place. A number of them were imprisoned, and Barbahari himself went into hiding. The reason of this lay in their frequent assaults on people and their constant stirring up of strife. An order was issued by Radi to the Hanbalis as follows: in the name of God, etc. Whosoever hypocritically makes show of piety and assaults the Muslims and thereby devours the goods of those who are in treaty with them is liable to wrath of the Lord of the worlds, the anger of God. So the Hanbalis used to, like, if you're going on the road and you didn't agree with their beliefs, they would steal all your goods and beat you up. And he is one of those who go astray. The commander of faithful has observed the conduct of a party among you, and he has probed the system of your chief, how he has made what is forbidden seem fair to his company, and how he lets down to them the rope of deceit. Of this nature is your occupying yourselves with debates about the Lord of might, whose name are blessed, and his prophet, and the throne and the seat, and you are speaking ill of the chosen among his people, and you are ascribing to the party of blessed prophet's house unbelief and error, and lying in wait to annoy them on the roads and in the resting places. So people who follow other sects like Sufis and Shias, they would wait on the side roads and they would attack them. Further, you're inviting the Muslims to adopt for their religion evident innovations and wicked doctrines not attested by the Quran, nor required by the ordinances of the merciful. You're disapproving visitation of the tombs of the Imams, whom God favor, and you're calumniating those who visit them as innovators, and that notwithstanding your disapproval of this, you assemble and combine to seek a common man who is neither noble nor related to nor connected with the Prophet, and command that his tomb should be visited and that prayer and supplication should be made by his ashes. So they were trying to destroy the tombs of people that other sects revealed, but they personally wanted everyone to visit Ahmad ibn Abd's tomb, which is kind of hypocritical. God's curse be upon a chief who has encouraged you to these improprieties. How vile he must be. And a demon who has made them seem fair to you. How misleading he must be. Now the commander of the faithful swears by God a solemn oath, which he may surely aid, that if you do not turn away from your evil way and your crooked path, he shall bestow on you blows in plenty, shall exile, slay, and scatter you. He shall employ the sword on your necks and the fire on your dwellings. So let him that is present tell him that is absent, for he that hath given warning hath made his excuse. And the commander of the faithful hath no guide, save God on him he relies, and to him he returns. During Caliph Radi's rule, the Hanbalis of Baghdad, under the leadership of Al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Barbahari, described by my respected professor Michael Cook at Princeton as a manifest demagogue, who pursued a new understanding of Al-Amr bil Ma'ruf, for they had worked out an ideology that prescribed moral activism in the public sphere, because according to them, the rulers were expected to suppress and annihilate theological deviations as seeds to perform this duty. The perceived theological threats of Shi'is, Ash'aris, Sufis, etc., and the Hanbali sense of responsibility motivated the Hanbalis to take matters into their own hands and confront the perceived threat to Islam. Therefore, those whom the other schools in Islam, the Hanafis, the Malikis, and the Shafis, looked at as the Ulul Amr, whose obedience is deemed compulsory, the Hanbalis disagreed and instead made effort to disobey and cause chaos wherever possible. This insurgency that they led in Baghdad led to the downfall of the great Abbasi Caliphate, not the Mongol invasion. And this al-Barbahari, the man who not only promoted but in action performed the impaling and burning alive of scholars and practitioners of other sects, is quite surprisingly still highly respected, and whose works are taught by the likes of Sheikh Saleh al-Fawzan, amongst others in Islamic universities in Saudi Arabia. Actually, should I be surprised? Moving on. Intolerance. Unwillingness to accept views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from one's own, and seeing those who disagree as inferior. A supposed legacy of Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb is that of intolerance towards other sects in Islam. Yet even this legacy may in fact also be one that originates much prior to Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb. A name unheard by none in both Islamic and Islamicate circles is that of Taqi Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, or just Ibn Taymiyyah, the medieval Damascene Hanbali jurist and theologian who gained timeless fame for being a hyper-religio activist, a word I coined myself, for he was known to go out of his way to scrutinize and criticize the status quo to extremely uncomfortable extents such that it became normative for him to declare other Muslims as innovators, idolaters, infidels, and much more. Thus, the fame of Ibn Taymiyyah lies mostly in his polemical works, specifically the attempted refutation of Imami Shi'ism in the form of Minhaj al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyyah. This work of his was an end result of a series of correspondences, debates in the form of letters with the notable Shi'i scholar Allama al-Hilli. And this can very well be seen from the title of Ibn Taymiyyah's book, which in itself is a rebuke of al-Hilli's work, Minhaj al-Karama fi Ma'rifat al-Imam. Moving on to understand the intolerant nature of Ibn Taymiyyah, the way he would address al-Hilli in correspondence and vice versa is rather substantial. Al-Hilli would address Ibn Taymiyyah as respected Shaykh, whereas Ibn Taymiyyah would address al-Hilli as Ibn al-Munajjas, son of the impure, noting that al-Hilli's father's name was al-Mutahhar, the pure. It is one thing to utilize terms as Rafidi, rejecter, mushrik, idolater, kafir, disbeliever, murtad, apostate, that no matter how severe are jurisprudential labels, however, hurling abusive epithets at one another is nothing but intolerance. Another form of intolerance special to Ibn Taymiyyah was his discounting of creeds other than his own. Upholding literalist tendencies as is normative for Hanbalis, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a treatise on what should be considered as a proper theological creed titled Al-Aqidat al-Wasitiyah. These literalist tendencies, in effect, made the treatise seem anthropomorphic in the view of the non-literalist schools, such as the Hanafi school, Maliki, Shafi'i schools. This should not have been problematic, for the author was Hanbali. However, Ibn Taymiyyah quite willfully brought conflict onto himself. He contended that his theological creed was mandatory on all Muslims. This resulted in numerous judicial hearings and periods of lengthy incarceration, of which all could be waved away simply if he were to recant his position and instead declare it mandatory only for the Hanbalis. Obviously, being the hyper-religio activist that he was, he rather accepted punishment over being flexible. This may be a reflection of Ibn Taymiyyah's height in piety and integrity, but it also reflects the height of his intolerance. I will not go into the numerous instances that Ibn Taymiyyah urged for the genocide of Sufis, Shias, and practitioners of other faiths, for you all are already aware of that, and that will require a presentation of its own. So in conclusion, therefore it has been briefly illustrated how a culture of terror found in ISIS does not exclusively derive from Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb, but instead is normative to the Hanbali school in general. And by arguing as such, I am not vindicating Ibn Abd al-Wahhāb, for he very much plays a role in the development of terror. But he's just not the father of terror. What does all this mean, especially in the study of ISIS? What this means is that ISIS is deeply rooted in Islamic history. It is not something new. Arguing that somehow there was a utopia prior to the Wahhabi movement is not just intellectually lazy, but also dishonest. We have shown, be it fundamentalism or militancy or intolerance, all are part and parcel of the Hanbali school of Islam. And Hanbalism is just as Islamic as is Hanafism, Malikism, Shafi'ism, or Jafri school of thought. Now, speaking as a practitioner of Islam, it should not embarrass me to the slightest by saying that ISIS is Islamic. We all know that ISIS does not represent the aspirations of the consensus of Muslims, but it most surely is our problem. It is an internal problem that we Muslims need to address. By constantly externalizing our problems, we allow foreign entities, namely imperialists, to fight the battles we ought to be fighting. Thank you.
Thanks, Shabbir, for enlightening us about. Yes, sure. And I was just going to open it up for Q&A, and I believe Mehdi already has a question for us. Yes, sir.
Hello, Shabbir. I just want to say I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just wanted to ask, like, how do you understand, like, great spiritualists like Abdul Qadir following the Hanbali school when you said that the Hanbali school was very against Sufism and they were very like anti-Sufi? How do you understand the relation between the Hanbali school and people who weren't necessarily against certain things at Hanbali school? Hanbali school is claiming to be part.
So everything isn't, especially with the Hanbali school, it's not set in stone. So early Hanbalis, they were quite against, for example, qiyas and ijma. But later Hanbalis, for example, in the Saudi kingdom, they're pro qiyas and ijma. So these things, they're not set in stone. So, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah himself adhered to a Sufi tariqah, but at the same time, he was saying things that were contrary to that, belief.
Thank you.
I have a question. Mr. Ziyaga?
Okay, yeah, so you said at the beginning that I believe there was a scholar who said that Al-Wahhab was the father of terror. He disagreed with her because you said it goes farther back from Al-Wahhab all the way to Ibn Taymiyyah, maybe even before. Now, so maybe you could describe better than her, how does Ibn Taymiyyah and all that lineage from what you're saying tie into ISIS and what's happening now, and this extremism now?
The Hanbali school of Islam, they all follow the Hanbali school of Islam.
But you just said there's so you're saying they follow this Saudi revised form of Hanbalism, and this is exactly what's.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb did isn't some new thing. It's not a revised thing. If al-Barbahari, for example, in Baghdad, if he accomplished political power, he would have done the same exact thing that Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhāb did. And one thing I want to make clear is that every school in Islam has some negative history. It's not just the Hanbalis that have negative history. I can show you Shi'is in history that kill people. I can show you Hanafis in history that kill people. But this is just a special circumstance. That's why we're looking at the Hanbalis.
Right, because of what's happening now in the news and how it ties into that.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm just trying to understand. So they all follow this certain revised version of Hanbalism, and this is what's causing all this damage. So how would, in your mind, how would you combat it? Not directly, but ideologically, how would you combat it?
See, my job is to present the information. It's the job of the policymakers to solve these problems.
All right, I got you.
Next question.
So a couple of questions. My first question is, you had mentioned how the Hanbalis were, in early history, were against people who had, certain Hanbalis were against people who had other schools of thought, like the Shia and the Ash'ari. But my first question is, at this time was because generally when, present day Salafis, Wahhabis, when it comes to the school of Aqidah, they will identify themselves as Athari, as opposed to Ash'ari. They make that distinction. Back then, was that distinction made in that particular Aqidah where, because the majority of Sunnis, I believe, fall under the Ash'ari in terms of the Aqidah beliefs. They either consider themselves Ash'ari or Maturidi. Those are the two main, like in terms of Aqidah, those are the two main ones. And would the Hanbalis back then have been like considered, oh, we're authority? And so then my second question is, how much of this can be attributed to Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself? Like, so for example, you have, in other schools of thought, you have Abu Hanifa, and certain things happened after him which are not attributed to him. Like the promotion of this school of thought was not because of, was not because of Abu Hanifa, it was because of one of his students who became very popular with the Abbas, Abu Yusuf. And so a lot of times people have this picture of, they like try to present a very extremely negative view of the, I'm speaking from the perspective of a Shia. They try to present Abu Hanifa in a negative light because of certain things, but the promotion of that particular school of thought was by the Abbasids, was by his student, Abu Yusuf, who became very prominent, the Abbasids. And so the analogy is that you have Abu Hanifa, who there's certain things attributed to him where it can't be attributed to him, it's more what came after him by those who claim to follow him. And so I'm wondering, is it the same thing with the Hanbals? Like, how much of it can be really attributed to Ahmad ibn Hanbal versus, people who came after him?
To answer your first question, I'm not, I apologize, I'm not sure of the dates, but it all goes back to the argument of, literalism versus non-literalism, and the usage of ijtihad. And your second question, you could just go back to what these, early scholars, what they left in terms of their written legacy. Like I mentioned before, Abu Hanifa, he left behind al-Fiqh al-Akbar, and Imam Malik left his Muwatta, which is not just a hadith book, it's hadith and his commentary in terms of fiqh. And Shafi, Imam Shafi left Kitab al-Umm, Kitab al-Risala fi Usul al-Fiqh, whereas Imam Ahmad only left his Musnad, which is just a bunch of narrations. So I'm not going to say that, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he wanted his school to go in this direction, but he gave them the methodology of focusing on just the narrations over anything else.
So basically, we can't categorically say he's ultimately responsible. That's kind of a gray area, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, I definitely would state that he is not responsible for whatever mess came after him.
Okay, yeah, that's what I can point.
Steve,
You very rightly bring up Al-Wahhab.
Right.
And in any review of Hanabala, he's a central figure.
Right.
In his Sharh Sunnah, he's one of the first and most active proponents of the idea that Abdullah ibn Saba is the founder of the Shia. And he also says in one of his other writings that it would better to be a prostitute or murderer than a follower of Abu Hanifa or a Shia. Do you think, as you have noted, that this tendency in Hanbali thinking isn't really representative of certain other Sunni schools? Do you think it's fair to say that people like Al-Wahhābī were, that if it wasn't for them, I should say, there would be better intra-religious dialogue between Sunni and Shia?
That's why I mentioned fundamentalism, and even though the word didn't exist back then, of course, but the school did begin as a fundamentalist movement, and that's why it's basically a Pandora's box. So Imam Ahmad might have been innocent to all this mess, but his methodology, was a Pandora's box.
So without that element in the other side of the world, we wouldn't necessarily see some of the same problems.
We wouldn't see this type of problem with ISIS, but other problems, of course, there was to be there.
Thank you.
He needs mic.
Assalamu alaikum, Shabbir. Good to see you again.
Thanks for coming.
You're welcome. I have a couple of questions. One is, I know that if you're following just Hadith as your and Quran but as literally as your only source of information about Islam, then that kind of negate having somebody come to your dreams to visit you. But I know that some Hanbalis did believe it. Hanbal would come to their dreams and speak to them, something like that. I was wondering, did he ever believe that himself, that like, say, Muhammad, peace be upon him, could visit you in your dreams?
Muḥammad ibn Abd?
Yes.
I would defer from the question because I haven't read anything on this, so I don't want to say something which is not accurate.
I understand.
Next question, okay?
Yeah, except that would be kind of interesting to see.
Right.
Because that kind of would make a new source of revelation. The other question I have is, like, kind of tracing the lineage of violence. I don't think that any of the four schools really respect the, I know I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Khazrajites, the ones who assassinated Ali, but their intellectual ideas kind of remind me of Ibn Hanbal's ideas. So I'm wondering if, like, they would kind of try to distance themselves from the same people, the Khazrajites, even though they kind of seem to have similar ideas.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Khawarij, the Ibn Miskawayh excerpt that I showed basically showed that the Abbasis had a similar point of view, that the Hanbalis were excluded from the community, meaning they were a form of Khawarij. And that was what the majority of Sunnis actually believed in that time too, because in Al-Barbahari's time, there was also famous scholar Tabari. Tabari, he disagreed with them, so basically every day, he wasn't allowed to leave his home. Every day would be pelted by rocks. And if anybody went to go visit him, he would get ambushed and beat. So even him, who was seen as like a mountain of knowledge in the Sunni school of thought, he was harassed immensely
By the Hanbalis?
by the Hanbalis of the time. And that's why, the Abbasis ruled them as Khawarij.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So are you saying that Ibn Taymiyyah is the father of terror?
No,
Humble?
just the word father of terror, I think you can't pinpoint one person. But I can,
No, attribute to ISIS.
ISIS as in the father of, I can pinpoint the methodology as the father of terror. Now, does the methodology go back to Ibn Hanbal? Yes, it does. Am I going to say that he's the father of terror? That would not be a correct thing for me to say. It would be inappropriate.
So, but for example, your argument on ISIS is not taking into account the political and historical aspect of colonialism to like a codification of Sharia and the methodology of Sharia
No, I don't disagree. They've made the problem a lot worse. Imperialists and foreign powers. But whatever we're seeing today is not something new. We've seen it before in history. So,
Could I ask Brother Mustard to clarify what he means by how colonialism is directly related to Takfiri thinking 800 years before colonialism in the law?
So before, for example, during the Khalifa, I'm talking about before European colonialism came into Muslim majority lands, like the British and the European, like mostly British, when they came in, they saw the courts, the Sharia courts, and like for example the Mufti and Qadis. That wasn't their full-time job, right? They had they didn't get paid to be a Mufti or a Qadi or as a interpretation, right? Like, these scholars weren't paid by them. That was their side job, and they had businesses as their economic, right? Other professions. So like the separation of whatever the ruler ruled or opinionated was separated from what the jurists and the mufti, like the qadis, ruled over the people with like consultation and everything. So what I'm saying is when the colonialism came with the codification like of actual written law as modern day law with that's from the government, it's putting out the it's putting the law under the state. So it's the combination of the state law with Sharia, which then serves only the leader. Like you see, the governments appoint the mufti, and whatever the mufti says has to agree with the leader, rather than what is the independency of the mufti, or the independency of the imam, or the independency of the scholar, right? So like of that I'm saying that could have influenced and made it worse.
Any other questions?
Just a quick comment. Thank you for this talk. I didn't realize, I wasn't aware that the Abbasids had a history of, with the exception of one individual, the founder actually, but like a policy against the Hanbali school of thought. I know the founder actually, and I don't know if this actually played into later Abbasids having a problem with the Hanbali school of thought. Ma'mun, I know was not on good terms with Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He was actually punished for this whole a particular position on the Quran being created or not created. And it's interesting that Ma'mun himself actually, I think, whipped Ahmad ibn Hanbal. I'm just curious if that played into later Abbasids having a position against the Hanbali.
I believe it definitely would have. He definitely would have had a negative opinion of the authorities. But we do find before this incident that the Abbasis did try to keep the Hanbalis happy by implementing Hanbali law in Baghdad. But that still didn't quell the insurgency.
I'm sorry, Hanbali law where?
In Baghdad.
Oh,
I think the two caliphs preceding Al-Radi, they tried implementing Hanbali law, but it didn't keep them happy. Here's a mic.
I think the roots of Torah in our Islamic history actually roots back maybe the day, maybe few days or a few months after the Prophet died. And I think we have a first incident of a prisoner who being burned alive for just political disagreement with one of the caliphs. And I will not mention anything more than this. I think you can Google it. And I think we have also another sort of terror under the name of Al-Futuhat al-Islamiyya, the Islamic victory. We were going to other nations trying to spread Islam by our sword. And I think this is pretty much, you can say, the very first rules of terror that should be recognized by the Islamic researchers.
I mean, that's an interesting comment. I wouldn't say that the roots are in the early generations of Islam, but the role of the Khalifa is very important. That's why we see the difference between Al-Qaeda and Daesh and ISIS in terms of violence. ISIS is far greater in violence because for them they believe that, for example, the hudud, the punishments can only be given if there's a Khalifa present. So for example, Al-Qaeda had a big problem in like Waziristan and other parts of Afghanistan of implementing hudud, punishments on the people. They would scold them and whatever, but they weren't able to punish them the way they wanted to punish because there was no authority figure. That's why ISIS was in such a hurry to bring about the caliphate and, appoint Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So, yes, caliphate can have a big role in terms of violence and this terror, but I wouldn't say that the first generation would be the root. They might take precedence from the first generation, but I wouldn't say that it's a root. Any other
Can I
questions?
add a comment? Actually, it is only in one of the caliphs in the first generation we didn't have any war with the outer Islamic world, and I think you know who is that caliph. That caliph was interested pretty much in building the entire Islamic state rather than going outside to cover some states. And I may be wrong, but I think we should be a little bit honest with ourselves.
No, I completely understand what you're saying, but in terms of the caliph you're speaking about, you're talking about the fourth caliph, right?
Yes.
Historically, he sent his sons on those battles to make sure that the rules of law were being followed. So that's just one comment. Because, for example, the defeat of Egypt, the conquering of Egypt, I believe his son Hassan was present. You know, so.
It is Egypt, not Europe.
No, Egypt, you know, conquering Persia, conquering Byzantium.
We went to different, not Arabian places. That's the problem.
Right. I get your point, but I don't want to. It's like a different subject, and I don't want to. It's kind of controversial. I don't want to delve into it at the moment. Stephen and
Just to go off of that brother's point, I'm not a historian, so this is my question to you, but as far as I know, you didn't see, so in Syria now, in Iraq now, we see not even forced conversions, we just see killing. If you are, Ismaili, if you're Christian, if Nashri, if you're any non-acceptable religious group, they'll kill you. I don't really see a history of forced conversion, even if you look at the Abbasid and the Umayyad dynasties. I see political hegemony being spread. So, for example, you mentioned the conquest of Misr. They didn't tear down the churches of Egypt. So, is my understanding correct that there was still a delineation between spreading Islam's political power and actually making theological creed incumbent on all? Am I just reading this, or do we see that delineation?
so you're saying in terms of early Islamic conquests, the usage of, in comparison to present day, what ISIS is doing in terms of destroying mosques, destroying temples, destroying churches, and forcing people to convert. In my research, I actually have seen that, they are asking Christians to give jizya. In terms of if you're Christian, you're offered a chance to give jizya. If you're in their point of view, if you're a Rawafid, you don't get that chance. Because Rawafid are apostates. You see? So they are giving the option. Otherwise, for example, you see Mosul, there would be no Christians left today, but there are still some Christians.
So their ISIS today is restricting this forced conversion to Shia. It's not the Christians have a choice.
Christians have a choice, but the jizya amounts to so much that it's not plausible to pay. So at the end of the day, they would also either have to flee or be killed.
So would it be fair to say that that's not reflected in the earlier?
That's not reflected in the early, because even, for example, the conquest of Jerusalem, the sacred sites of the Christians and obviously the Christians destroyed the sacred sites of the Jews, but the sacred sites of the Christians were not destroyed, they were kept intact.
Yeah, I think some Jews saw them as liberators, or at least when they conquered, Muslims came into Europe, I think a lot of Jews saw them as that.
Yes, what I've read, Jews have seen even not just Jews, but even Coptics. When the Muslims conquered Egypt, they saw the Muslims as liberators. But I'm not sure if those are from Muslim sources or, if they're neutral sources or not. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just going to go off on what Brother Ahmed and Brother Steve said. I'm sorry, you don't want to delve into this stuff, but he got me kind of curious. Now, basically, he said the extremism was kind of born after the caliphate. Now, he referenced before, so I'm not going to make him, but Do you think that that transitioned into the Hanbali, or is that something else completely? That's my first question.
You're saying what occurred in the early generations, if it had anything to do with the
With the Hanbali that you were talking about. That
early school of thought.
Yeah.
I mean, every school in Islam wants to follow the original version of Islam because that's a pure version. It's just your methodology you're getting there,
Okay.
you know. So the Hanbalis chose a fundamental method to get there. That was their route. The Malikis and Hanafis, Shafis chose a different route, you know. But that doesn't mean that both of them were looking. Those other schools were looking for something else. They're looking for the same thing.
All right. So, and my other question would be kind of going off what Steve said. The earlier Muslim, the earlier Muslim empire, I don't call it empire, kingdoms, like after the Sahaba, like way after the Sahaba.
After the four.
Yeah, like 1,000 years ago, like let's just say estimate.
Okay.
So obviously this Hanbali thought was existing, this extreme Hanbali thought was existing under them. How did they deal? Do you know how they dealt with it? Do you know how they like contained it, or no? Do you not know how they contained it?
Right. So like I mentioned, the Abbasis, which is one of the kingdoms that you're talking about, they tried to declare the Hanbalis as outside of Islam. You know, by banning their meetings, banning the teaching of their school, you know, but obviously it didn't work. But
And after the Abbas is what I'm mainly referring to, like let's say under Salah ad-Din, I mean after him, how did they contain it? Did they contain it even?
well, I mean, sometimes, you know, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, sometimes his views that were contrary to the ruling power caused him to be imprisoned. But sometimes in time of war, you actually need these type of views. So when the Crusades were going on, or fighting other sects in Islam, such as the Alawis in the Levant, you know, Ibn Taymiyyah's views were very much required by the ruling power.
So it was like kind of like I use it when I need it, when it's against my interest.
Exactly.
Just like politics kind of.
It is fun.
Okay, I got you. Any other questions? I kind of answered the question.
Well, I kind of wanted to speak to what you were saying. Thank you. It's just like the way I look at the separation between politics and religion. For instance, the whole thing about after the Prophet died, and then like, the sudden charging people holy war and all that. I think it was more like the war of apostasy. Was the first one, was the first fighting that came in the name of Islam after the Prophet died. To me, I see that more as like, if the United States is South, you know how they're always trying to secede from the Union, or Texas is always trying to secede. After the Prophet died, they didn't think that Islam applied to them anymore. Like they had agreed to be Muslim, but they didn't understand, like, they saw it more as a political alliance. So when the Prophet died, they were like, okay, I guess we can just go back to doing our thing now. We don't have to pay any taxes or anything like that. So I would see more as like a political thing, like the same thing if Texas tried to secede from the Union, you know, Obama would be like, we'll go to war to try to keep you in the United States. Not so much as like, we're going to try to convert, like forced conversions and all that. I don't think that forcing people to convert was the big thing. I think a lot of it was getting people to come back into the fold after they'd already agreed to stay in forever. And yeah, that's what I think it was.
So, yeah, that was just a comment, or was it a question as well?
I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I think that.
I mean, as a researcher, I don't believe that there was ever a time of utopia. So even, for example, during the Ridda Wars that you're talking about, there were things that were not Islamically correct. For example, the execution of Malik ibn Wahhāb. You guys know Malik ibn Wahhāb's story? So he was the tax collector of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in a certain tribe. And after the Prophet died, he, like some other companions, didn't accept the caliphal authority of the first caliph. Does that make him outside the fold of Islam? That is his question. So basically, he went to go dialogue with Khalid bin Walid, and end result was he was executed and his head was put in a pot and boiled for others to see as a form of didactic punishment. Is that Islamically allowed? In terms of what I've read, I don't think that would be allowed. So there was no time of utopia except, as a Muslim practitioner, there was no time of utopia except during the Prophet's rule himself. That was the last question, Brother.
I believe so. Thanks again for your